For those who are not familiar with our organization, we are a voice for the community of Ocean Park. We are involved in a lot of activities that we hope make the community a better place. We'd love to have you come join us and help us do a little bit more of that. Let's see. We got 3 main objectives tonight. One is to vote for a new board of directors. Voting will be open until 7:30, so you don't have to rush. We'll introduce the board. For those of you who don't know, people running at 7, right after the panel discussion, so if you want to hold on, that's fine. We're going to have a panel discussion on the airport. And lastly, but not least, we're going to have a visit from the city manager, Rod Gould, who's going to tell us a little about the city, city budget, and take questions from us. So I'd like to move to the panel discussion now, which is being graciously moderated by Council Member McKeown. And we're going to be taking questions on 3x5 cards. Several of you have submitted questions already, which we have passed on in advance to Cathy, and he'll consider those in the appropriate fashion. As this is an Ocean Park Association meeting, we ask that only Ocean Park residents submit questions. If you don't live here, if you have a friend who does, get them to submit questions. Those cards are going to be collected by, I believe, Lori and Michelle. Is that correct? Lori and Michelle? Okay. So, have you guys passed the cards out? Okay. So they'll be distributing those and then collecting those and bringing them up. Okay. Then, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kevin McKeown, and he will introduce our distinguished panelists.
Actually, I am just one of your 7 Santa Monica City Council members. I see about over the city back. So there's great interest in our city on this subject. Our city manager, Rod Gould, will be here in about an hour to talk about general state of the city. But some of you at Ocean Park have told us you've been noticing airplanes flying. So the Ocean Park Association asked me to moderate this panel tonight to talk about what's gone on, what's going on, and what solutions we may be able to find together. You probably know the city is in the process of a very, very large study to determine what options we have. We're actually at the end of phase 1 and about to enter into phase 2 of a 3-phase project. In phase 1, we interviewed people who did not have either of the extreme positions. That is to say, people who didn't want to close the airport, but they also didn't want to keep it just the way it is. That was to find out if there was a middle ground, because frankly, our initial impression of people has been this is a very polarizing issue. People either love the airport, don't want to change a thing about it, or they want to close the airport. We want to find out, is there a middle ground? We also asked some economic studies to be made and some possible land use of the airport land to be examined. So we know what options might be possible before we move into phase 2. We're working with the FAA to change the plans, and we had a consultant work on that as well. But the next phase, phase 2, is our chance to hear from you, from everybody, no matter what your opinion, shut it down, keep it, or somewhere in between. We're going to do that with an open house coming up at the airport next month. We'll talk about it. And then a series of focus groups, small meetings of maybe 12 people, where you can really talk to each other and to the moderator and give an opinion on what could happen with the airport. All that information will eventually come back to the city council. The hope of what we're doing tonight is to make people at Ocean Park better participants as those focus groups come up. Because these 4 panel members can explain different points of view on what has happened and what could happen with the airport. Again, we're hoping to come up with solutions on what are perceived as problems with the airport. We as a city can't necessarily just snap our fingers and make it happen. I think everybody knows by now the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, has a great deal to say about how an airport is run. We have some limited jurisdiction with what happens on the ground. The moment an aircraft leaves the ground and is in the air, we have no say at all. We have a noise ordinance that's supposed to keep under a certain decibel limit, but we can't tell aircraft where to fly. And And really the way that this whole thing began for Ocean Park as a hot issue was a change that the Federal Aviation Administration made in where the aircraft flew. They tried a pilot where they had some of the aircraft that used to go out over the Penmar Golf Course turn on what's called the 250 heading, which set those aircraft over Ocean Park. Many of us feel it doesn't make sense to send aircraft over the hills of Ocean Park when there's a simple flat way for the aircraft to get out to the ocean. The problem is we're near LAX, and the aircraft going straight out impinge on the takeoff pattern from LAX, and the FAA has to coordinate those two. That pilot program ended, but I think many of us still perceive that too many planes are flying over Ocean Park. And many people in the city feel that the airport itself has gotten out of control, that what used to be a propeller aircraft airport, a big factory for Douglas aircraft, and a big factor in the Santa Monica economy back in the 40s, has been turned over to corporate jets. And it's a whole different airport from what people knew about when they moved here. So tonight in our discussion, we're going to try and focus on three general realms. The first is going to be the environmental studies that have been done, and the possible health impacts of that in the airport, in the area. Jets and propeller planes use forms of fuel that are not regulated like your car is. Propeller planes use leaded fuel. Jets use essentially kerosene, which leaves partially burned hydrocarbons, which have settled on people's furniture living in the airport. We're also going to look at the economic story of the airport. As I say, back in the 40s, this used to be a big industrial center that at one point, I believe, employed as many as 40,000 people in the region. That's not true anymore. So who makes money from the airport now? Many people in the region think that Santa Monica makes a lot of money from the airport. I think as we're going to hear, that's not true. And then the real purpose of tonight is to focus on solutions. We know that in 2015, our current contract with the FAA expires, and we get new options at that point. We're working on what might be done in 2015, certainly, but we also want to make changes we might be able to make in the shorter term. Are there ways to reduce the impact of airplanes over Ocean Park now? Now, as Jan said, this is an open forum. It's not a city event. It's not sponsored by the city of Santa Monica. We're focused tonight on how the airport affects Ocean Park. So for people from other parts of town, from outside the city, you may not hear all of your concerns addressed. We're focused on Ocean Park tonight. The panel here is quite capable of discussing this issue from four very different points of view, I think. At the far end is Martin Pastucha, the Director of Public Works for the City of Santa Monica. He has been appointed by our city manager, Bob Gould, to take the lead on airport issues. So he can really talk about what the city is doing right now. Next to Martin is Cathy Larson, who many of you may know is the longtime chair of the Airport Committee for Friends of Sunset Park. The neighborhood around the airport has been impacted by it for many years, and Cathy's been working on this for over a decade that I know of personally. Next is Rick Brown, who is the chair of the City of Santa Monica Airport Commission. This is the appointed body that is advisory to the City Council that meets once a month to talk about the airport and what might be done. And so they have some very interesting perspectives on what we can do between now and 2015 and what we might do in 2015 when the contract runs out. And lastly, sitting immediately next to me is Joe Justice, who is the owner of Justice Aviation. That is one of the 6 flight schools that currently operates at Santa Monica Airport. So we're going to begin tonight's discussion by letting each of these people tell you a little bit more than that about how they've come to this and what their view of the airport is at this point in time. And then we have some questions that will be given to us by OPA, and we'll go along and ask the questions. But let's start with this end, Joe, and ask you to expand a little bit on your involvement with the airport and where you see us going from here.
If you don't mind, I'm going to pass the mic down because I saw most of the questions. I'm happy to talk at the end if everybody else is speaking. Most of the questions that were submitted to me about what probably would be asked tonight didn't pertain to me really. So I'll pass the mic down if you don't mind, and then come back to me if there's time, because there's not much time tonight.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Kevin. I am on the Airport Commission because I'm a concerned resident living in Sunset Park. And before that, I lived in Mar Vista, 2 blocks south of the airport. So we've had a lot of experience with the airport over the 3 decades that we've lived in this area. And I can tell you that we have a lot of concerns about the impact of the airport on our lives and on the lives of all of our neighbors and the communities in Santa Monica and in parts of West LA. Those impacts involve issues of safety. We, on August 29th, had an example of a crash of a light plane into Sunset Park, right adjacent to the airport. So that's certainly a concern that we all face and share with respect to planes falling from the sky, either onto our homes, onto a school, onto the golf course, or anywhere else where they might injure not only the people in the plane, but people on the ground. Secondly, very concerned about health impacts. We know, as Kevin said, that propeller planes use leaded fuel, and when they fly, there are emissions of lead into the air. Those emissions fall to the earth, and they deposit themselves in places, and it's a very difficult thing to measure adequately. There have been some attempts, and but understanding fully the potential health impacts of long-term exposures to some of these particles of lead is a challenge. Another area is the jet fuel. Jet fuel emits carcinogens in ultrafine particles that can deposit themselves in our lungs and be ingested into our bodies. We don't know the long-term impact of that. Part of the impact depends on what's called the dose, meaning how much we actually get exposed to, how much we actually breathe in and ingest. And there's very little that's well understood about the specific impacts of Santa Monica Airport in this respect. The third area of concern is noise. And many of us are bothered by noise. I know where we lived before, here just south of the airport, we had a huge noise factor from the airport. Where we live now, it's much less. But where people live determines what that noise level is going to be with respect to planes flying overhead, doing pattern flying, or other things which bring them into the community's vicinity. So these are the issues that I know I'm concerned about, that the Commission is concerned about, and that we discuss regularly. We try to bring issues to the attention of the City Council, and we try to be an open forum for community members to bring their concerns forward, gain visibility and hearing in an organized way in which we can then try to communicate some of that up to the City Council and recommend actions. That's the role of the Commission. And on November 28th, we are having, which is Monday, in the evening at City Hall, in the City Council chambers, we're having a workshop that will focus on 2 reports that were recently presented as a part of the visioning process. One is a report by RAND on the future uses of the airport property, and I'd like to say a few things about that later. And the second is on the HR&A study of the economic fiscal impact of the report on the area, and we can talk about that as well. Cathy?
Thanks. I'm Cathy Larson with Friends of Sunset Park, and I got involved with the airport issues, as Kevin said, quite a few years ago, because of the noise impacts in my neighborhood, and we were instrumental in changing the fine structure for the noise violators. And I would encourage all of you here, if you're interested in airport issues and the airport, to go to the airport open house on December 10th and sign up for one of the focus groups that the city is going to sponsor. If you're not able to make that workshop open house, Bob Tremor, who's sitting at the back, is the airport director, and Martin Pastucha here. They will take your information and put you on the list so you can participate in one of the focus groups. And we really encourage everybody to sign up for one of those groups. And you don't have to even be a resident of Santa Monica. If you want to participate, please sign up.
Thank you. As Councilmember McKeown indicated, my name is Martin Pastucha. I'm the Director of Public Works. And Public Works recently assumed the responsibility for the oversight of the airport. So that includes the day-to-day operations, the oversight of the noise ordinance, enforcement program, as well as the operation of the leases and all the aspects of the operation of the airport. And at this point in time, obviously, we're very interested in all the aspects that have been indicated by the various speakers today. Obviously, as the operator of the airport, it is our job to make sure that, to the best of our ability, that the airport is a compatible and a acceptable neighbor for the residents of the community.
Let's jump right into the environmental issues, which I know concern a lot of people because, you know, we all breathe the air that comes off the airport. Let me ask a question that came from the overall board of directors first to Rick and Mark, and then maybe Cathy and Joe can follow up on this. I know that we've done studies on this, but just to go through it so people who will be participating in the workshops and focus groups know. Tell us what kind of studies the city has conducted regarding the air at Santa Monica Airport, particularly air pollution, but also safety controls. Are there other studies we're in the process of doing, or we anticipate getting results soon? What is the status of Senator Ted Lieu's request that the state study the environmental impacts and air pollution impacts of the airport? Is the city part of that study? And has there been any follow-up to the study that was done a year ago when the airport was closed for several days, and we got an idea of what the air quality on the west side would be like without the airport? Martin, why don't you start and then we'll go to Rick.
The city has conducted a number of studies over the years, both on safety and environmental impacts. In 2000, the city initiated a review of the airport's operational design to determine its compatibility with the increased use of jet aircraft at the airport. Part of that was to come up with a series of design standards to look at what sort of safety factors could be implemented, and that study was brought forth. Again, it looked at the proximity of the homes to the airport and in terms of what measures could potentially be implemented to make that a safer place. Environmental studies, the city's done, is involved in a number of studies in cooperation with the Southern California Air Quality Management District and the U.S. EPA. And there's been 3 groundbreaking air quality studies. The first was done in December 2002 into increasing complaints about emissions and impacts from jet aircraft on air quality. The Southern California Air Quality Management District studied the air quality issues related to general aviation aircraft in airports. And the city of Santa Monica volunteered this airport as one of the ones as a study site. The studies were undertaken by McKeown in 2005-2006 after they received the federal EPA grant, and that was one of the first studies in the nation on general aviation airport emissions. In March 2009, the city participated with U.S. EPA on a study on the monitoring and modeling of piston aircraft leaded fuels. And in addition, the third study that I talked about was Councilman McKeown alluded to the study during the closure of the airport, during the 5 days closure of the airport in December 2010 when the runway was repaid. The AQMD came out and did some supplemental monitoring to determine, and again in conjunction with their earlier study in 2006, to look at the air quality impacts when there weren't any aircraft flying. The results of that study, again, the other previous studies are available on the airport website. So you'll be able to pull those studies up and look at those. And the recent information from December 2010, the results will be presented by AQMD at the January Airport Commission workshop on environmental issues. So the AQMD will be coming out in January and making that presentation at that time. And that meeting is scheduled for January 23rd, 2012, the City Council Chamber. That is when we do the annual environmental workshop, and those results of that study will be presented at that time. The other question had to do regarding Senator Ted Lieu, and at that point in time, Senator Liu sent a letter to the Department of Toxic Control, Substance Control, and we have not heard anything back from the Department of Toxic Control as to whether they have started any study or contact at the airport at this time. When we do hear from the Department of Toxic Control, Substance Control, it's our intention to cooperate fully with them on the study, volunteer Santa Monica for study, for use as a study site. But we have not heard anything at this point in time. And Rick,
I think Martin gave a very good summary of the studies that have been done. I might just add that in reading these studies, I think there's a common conclusion. The conclusion is that clearly Santa Monica Airport has the planes flying from Santa Monica Airport have an impact. They increase emissions. So, for example, the study that was done comparing the period when there were no flight operations out of SMO to the period before and after that showed what you would expect, that there was an increase in emissions related to the operations of the airport in the immediate area around the airport. Studies done by the EPA on lead emissions, those studies have similarly shown that there is an impact of the airport. The problem with all of these studies is that it's one thing to note that there's an increase in emissions, but it's another thing to really be able to, with any acceptable level of precision, estimate the amount of that impact across a geographic area that's fairly wide in relation to the airport, both at the north end, hitting the Mar Vista area, and at the south end, over Sunset Park and Ocean Park and Venice. So I know that the EPA is trying to develop a model to make those estimates. They use Santa Monica Airport as a study site, and that should be very helpful. But I don't think we have any definitive results from any of those studies about what the actual impact is on the communities and on their health. I think there is a need for such studies and for developing better scientific tools to measure and estimate those impacts. Because we do know that there are people living there are children in these areas, there are elderly people with health problems, and that these kinds of emissions can have a detrimental impact on health. So we need to develop a better way to make those estimates. I will say that Santa Monica Airport has cooperated with all of those studies. Those studies wouldn't take place if Santa Monica, the city of Santa Monica and the airport hadn't said, make us a study site, please. We will provide data and we will provide access. So I think the city has been very cooperative and forthcoming about that. I think the limitations are in the amount of resources that these public agencies outside have put into conducting these studies and coming up with definitive results.
Well, thank you, Martin and Rick. You've done a great job of explaining what the studies have been done and why they were done and what the science involved is. But as Rick questioned, what does it all mean? I mean, what do we end up doing with this information as we get it? And so the open board is asking the follow-up question from Cathy and Joe. Cathy, you've been working on the issues for years. You know of other studies done by UCLA, the study done by Pinko's son for John Adams Middle School project. It actually came out with pretty incredible new information a few years ago. And Joe, you operate aircraft, so I'd be curious to know the points of view of someone who's been looking at this for a long time and someone who operates aircraft. Are these studies credible? And if they are, what changes do they suggest to you that could be made either in 2015 or in shorter term? I'll start with Cathy.
I think the studies are credible. I think probably the problem is the inertia of the government, because first you have these studies, but to actually get the standards changed on a federal level takes a lot of time. And as Rick was mentioning, the ultrafine particles that we're discovering can have really adverse health effects. There isn't even a standard for those at this time. And I talked to one of the city staffers earlier today regarding that, and he said that in his interfacing with the EPA, they optimistically estimate 3 to 5 years to set a standard, and that unfortunately the city of Santa Monica can't say, oh, we want this standard here at our airport because of federal laws and interstate commerce. All those sorts of standards have to be set on a federal level. So it makes it very challenging for especially the residents on the east side of the airport who have the most exposure to the emissions, and some of them are here today. Virginia is here, and Martin Ribbon, and their neighborhoods in particular are very much so impacted by that. So it's a very frustrating thing for the residents in terms of that.
I've heard of some of the studies, and I'm not an expert on them. I haven't read them. I can say that, from all the literature I read in aviation, there is an awareness, of course, that leaded fuel will not be with us long. There are, just so you know, to give you some background knowledge, there are planes like the ones we operate at our flight school that could easily run on automobile fuel if you take certain things out of it, like ethanol. Ethanol has a way of eroding rubber hoses, and that's not very good in an airplane. When you lose a fuel hose, it leads to some safety problems. Leaded fuel is necessary for high compression engines that you find on some of the stronger aircraft that are out there. And there is a great deal of money being spent right now trying to come up with a solution to it, because I think everybody knows the bottom line is the EPA will not allow it forever. The government will eventually flip and say, okay, that it's got to be out no matter how many people in the aviation industry are put out of work. That will probably happen at some point in time, but I have a feeling what will truly happen is the technology will come around so that the lead is out of aviation fuel, and hopefully something that is not, considered as harmful as lead is there. I would ask, though, I always think that there might be some mother with a child who sees the cars about jet pollution and the questioning of the poison over their home. I would ask that you look at the people in this room who are my age, I'm about probably 59 in January, or even 50 years old, and consider that for a large amount of years, thousands of cars were driving on the freeway that were spitting out lead, using leaded fuel. And now what you have is a few planes, taking off. Somebody said 1 every 3 minutes, whatever it is, burning about 10 gallons an hour. And I got the information, but I forgot how many grams of lead are in their fuel. So if we put this in perspective, so that mother with her child doesn't have to worry too much. Yes, there is something bad going into the atmosphere. Yes, if your child peels the leaded paint off the wall and eats it, it's very bad. And a room full of leaded gas would probably be horrible. But with the billions or thousands of cars that were driving on the freeway through half of my life, spitting out lead in tons, we now have a few airplanes, the thickness of this paper. So it will, I think, get resolved. And the mother should sleep fairly well, that we're not dumping tons of lead on our house. There is some lead. And in time, I think it will be resolved.
So I think we've heard that there are definitely environmental effects at the airport, but we don't know to what degree they impact individual health, and there's some disagreement as to whether they are truly significant or not, as we've heard from different members of the panel. I want to move on to the second general realm regarding the airport that the overall board has asked us to discuss, and that's the economic. A lot of people seem to feel that there's much we could be doing about the airport. The city doesn't really want to because we make so darn much money running that airport, which actually is not the case. But the economic impact of having an airport in the community is an important part of the discussion we have to have over the months to come as we do the focus group. So let me start with Martin, speaking as a city staff person. We hear complaints from the surrounding communities in particular that the city of Santa Monica gets all the economic benefit of the airport. Well, really, what are those benefits? Do we make money as an airport? Do the benefits that are economic city and for the region. And what are we trying to do to get the story out there? Because I think many of the local and regional papers have picked up the story that Santa Monica benefits greatly by having the airport. And at least one elected official in the region says all the time that, we make all the money, we blow the smoke into his people's houses. Can you tell us where we are with that? Because I know we've done some work on trying to figure out what the economics of our airport really are.
Thank you. As indicated, the city had conducted some studies as part of the Phase 1 visiting process. One of those studies was conducted by a group called HRNA. They are advisors. They are an economic analysis firm that has done a number of these models, both related not just to airports, but related to development throughout the communities here and elsewhere. They generally use a model called an implant model, and essentially it's an input-output model of economic data specific to the geography of the city. And they take this data based on census data information as well as economic indicators that come out from the community. Using this model, what it did was it gave us a snapshot of what the city, the economic impact or the economic operations at the airport campus mean to the community as a whole. And that information was presented on the October 4th workshop as part of the Phase 1 access. In addition to that was, again, after a lot of comment that were made at the October 4th impact, is all we talked about is that it only benefits Santa Monica. What does it do to the other communities? The city commissioned HRNA to do an additional study on the economic impact to the other areas around the airport and what that means. And that information, we've just released that information today. It is on the city's website. But essentially, I'll give you a quick summary of what it is. First, I'll cover what covered in the HRNA study of the city. What it essentially said was that the HRNA study indicated that the airport itself, there's a number of jobs, I think a total of 894 jobs that are related directly as a result of the airport. And these come from a number of different, almost 177 total businesses on the airport campus. Some are aviation related, some are non-aviation related. There's almost 2/3 of those businesses have only 1 or 2 employees, so a lot of small businesses are located on the airport campus. In addition, 85% of those 177 businesses have less than 6 employees. So again, small business seems to be a primary driver of what happens on the airport campus site. What it indicated is that as a result of the Santa Monica Airport's jobs, there was 894 direct jobs associated with the airport. There was 242 indirect jobs and 353 induced jobs. And the indirect jobs are a result of those jobs that are in the community as a result of spending of the result of the direct jobs, the spending of those, the induced jobs, and those that sort of the third effect of the folks that receive income from the direct jobs spending off. In terms of total economic impact, what it indicated was that the total output from the airport is a total of $275.2 million per year. That's an annual economic output from the airport. And that's 197 in direct impact, 43 million in indirect impact, and 44 million in induced impact. Again, these are as a result of the types of jobs that are created. Again, we're talking about 177 different job categories there. So let's talk about, so of those 894 jobs, or I should say the total jobs that were input as a result of the airport, the 1,300.
Maybe more overview.
Sure, I'm sorry. I got a little too much in the weeds here, so a lot of detailed information. I think what it did was it showed that the multiplier of the jobs that are created as a result of the airport have a higher spending impact than some of the other jobs in the lower categories. But again, the jobs range a very broad number of categories at the airport. In addition, the information that's going out is available on the city's website today regarding regional jobs or jobs within the Los Angeles area. It showed that there's a total of 31 indirect and induced jobs as a result of the airport outside of the city of Santa Monica, which have an annual impact of $53.9 million in indirect and induced input in the city of Los Angeles, which essentially surrounds the airport on 3 sides. So the airport is not just generating economic activity for the city of Santa Monica, but it also has indirect economic activity for the city of Los Angeles as well.
Warren, you didn't tell them about the actual airport budget, right? That the city doesn't actually make money off of the airport.
The airport budget itself is approximately $5 million, and in fact, this year the airport is breaking even. But this is one of the few years that the airport has broken even. In the past, there's always been some level of support for the direct operations of the airport. That is the city staff and the maintenance and operation and capital facilities for the airport itself. So it's an aging facility that needs additional investment of dollars into it to bring it up to current status. So it is not a money-making venture for the city. It is the best break-even operation.
I wanted to make a couple of comments about that HRNA study. I thought that it was useful for understanding the sort of global impact of the airport on our economy. What I think is neglected was to, one, separate the aviation and non-aviation businesses at the airport, I believe. Is that correct? So that we don't really have a good assessment of what the economic impact is of the aviation part of the operations versus the non-aviation. The non-aviation are the rentals of offices, basically, studios, things like that. The aviation impacts are the flight operations and the revenue that they bring in. But they also bring in certain costs to us in the city and the community. One of those costs has to do with the market values of our homes. So many of us might perceive a diminished market value of our homes as a result of some of the aviation activities at the airport. That's not figured into the study. Another thing that is not figured into the study is the risk to the city of future potential environmental and other kinds of impacts of the airport. If there were a crash into a building and there were a lot of people killed, would the city be sued as a consequence of that? If there was some environmental impact at the airport that was measurable and put people at risk or actually killed people, would there be a lawsuit against the city that could expose the city to significant future costs? These are not directly measurable, but they certainly could be estimated, and the risks could be estimated and considered as potential future costs. So I think these are some things that the City Council ought to understand about the airport as we go forward, and not just focus on the sort of broader global impacts.
If I could do one follow-up. In the HRNA study, there were two areas where it identified direct impact. You mentioned aviation operations. In terms of total jobs, what it indicated by transport by air, which was one of the larger job categories, had a total of 178 employees employed in that particular sector, with an economic impact of $54 million. So those were probably the closest that you talk about in terms of airport operations and the benefits or the cost and revenue associated with those.
Can I just respond to that? I think that's useful, and thank you. I'm sorry I neglected that. But you want us to move on?
Yes.
Let me just mention. So there are some economic benefits that are left out of that as well, with respect to the kinds of industries that are supported as a result of having the airport and the convenience that executives and CEOs have of the access to the airport and to flights. But I think that there are also a lot of costs associated with those things that we don't fully understand.
Very quickly, Joe, you own and operate a small business at the airport, just so we have a sense of scale. How many people do you employ and how many students do you have?
There are 17 employees at our place, and number of customers is, it's an ongoing circle. We have people training with us now, probably in the neighborhood of about 35 or so. but we rent planes to the general public, and there are names on our list that have probably been there a long time, and they're maybe not active. There's a total of about 2,000 names, but I would say probably about 300 or 400 of them are probably truly active. Regarding the funding, I just want to mention that, of course, the city of Santa Monica doesn't want to do it, but the FAA would fund the airport if the city wanted to take more grant money, but the city, of course, is operating on the idea that they will be able to close the airport come the end of when the money is spent in 2023, in spite of the fact that the old land transfer says it'll be an airport in perpetuity. So there is a chance that the city would continue to fund the airport, whatever cost it is, and in 2023, a legal case could determine that the perpetuity holds, and the city would have spent all that money between now and then, and find out that it still has to get airport.
So we're going to move into the solutions part of our discussion now. As Joe just said, our city has quite deliberately not taken federal money for 20 years, because when we take a grant from the federal government, that obligates us to continue running the airport the way it is for 20 years after the money came in. So it has been our idea that it is worth the investment to pay to run the airport ourselves, to be free at last in 2015. But there's some question as to how free we will be in 2015. And before we move into other parts of problem solving, let's look at the next few years. We've identified here some problems we feel there are at the airport. This might be the last economic question in a way. Rick, let me ask you, because I know the commissioners have been thinking about this. How might the city raise fees, etc., at the airport to be able to fund some of the short-term solutions to make the airport a better neighborhood? I know you've been talking about that with the commission, about raising landing fees, that sort of thing.
The issue has come up. We haven't had a really thorough discussion of it, and I don't feel that I know enough to make a direct comment on the landing fee issue. But I will say that the fees paid by operators by flights to land and take off, I think are really, that those operations occur at a loss to the city. The fact that there is not enough revenue generated to even pay for some of the operating costs of the airport related to those kinds of operations. But I think that's an issue that, frankly, I don't understand very well. I think in 2015, which is not very far away from now, when the current operating agreement between Santa Monica and the FAA terminates on July 1, 2015, there will be some opportunities for the city to begin to make changes. Some of the airport is very committed to flight operations as a result of, I believe it's the transfer agreement. Cathy probably knows more about this than I do, and Martin. But certainly there is certain land that isn't a part of that the city could withdraw from aviation use directly. And that actually could reduce the length of the runway, which could force the issues of the jets that fly in and out of Santa Monica Airport, and really curtail the ability of the larger jets to land and take off from the airport. I'm not an expert on that, and perhaps can I turn to Cathy or Martin for that? Bring it back to you.
What I'd like to do to make sure that we focus on what will be helpful to people and participate in the upcoming focus groups is jump forward now to 2015. And we know that in 2015, we at least have a chance of making significant changes. The question I have for you is, well, what changes should we make? What should we do about the airport? How can we mitigate the problems that have been identified associated with the airport? How many flight schools do there need to be in an airport? How many jets can be allowed in and out? What about these faster jets that the FAA itself says really shouldn't be allowed to land on an airport runway as short as ours are? We now have what are called fixed base operators that sell aviation fuel. Could we stop selling leaded fuel? Could we stop selling jet fuel? Do we have to provide fuel at all at an airport? Would that reduce the use of the airport? let's just have a little bit of sort of open thinking about what could happen in 2015. I know it's arguable whether we were going to be able to prevail in what's bound to be a very heated disagreement with the Federal Aviation Administration. But if we could, what would we want? Let's start with Cathy.
Mr. Justice mentioned about the grant money, and his date was, the expiration was in 2023. That's a date in dispute. The city's position is it's 2015. The FAA says it's 2023 because of an installment that was made later. And so the expiration date is calculated at a different place. That being said, if the city decides not to close the airport or not to try to close the airport because of the obstacles that would ensue, there's other things that we've discussed in our neighborhood group, besides raising the landing fees, perhaps raising the fuel flowage tax, things like limiting the number of tie-downs. The tie-downs are parking space for aircraft, limiting the size of the tie-downs. One of our other members had started a discussion on toxic torque insurance and requiring that. Right now the 84 agreement requires the city maintain 3 FBOs, that's a fixed-base operator that services aircraft. Are we required to do that after the expiration of the 84 agreement? Maybe we don't have to have any. Maybe we don't have to sell fuel at all. Maybe we don't have to sell jet fuel. The Torrance Airport does not sell any jet fuel. So there are options to be looked for, and we hope that some of these options might be explored further. We actually were hoping that the RAND study that was conducted was going to look at some of these options and give us perhaps best practices at other airports, but the resulting of that consultant findings, I guess they call it, was that they really only studied the non-aviation land. So we were very disappointed about the findings on that that were presented from RAND on the October City Council meeting. And I know that at the upcoming Airport Commission meeting is actually a workshop format with representatives from RAND and HRNA. A workshop format means that the public can actually ask questions, as opposed to a regular meeting format where you can just give a public comment and you have a limited amount of time. You can actually ask questions to the presenters and the commissioners if you want to get more information about something. So if you are interested in finding out more about the studies that were conducted and the airport issues, it would be a really good meeting to attend. And that's the 28th? Monday the 28th, 7:30 in the City Council chambers. And also, like I said before, we're hoping in the discussion groups that they will be run in an open manner and that all these options can be discussed and put on the table for possibilities. We felt that the way the consultants conducted their studies was done in a manner that we didn't really find very helpful. And we were extremely disappointed, and if you were at that City Council meeting, the temperature of the attendees was not very happy. So,
just to reinforce something that Cathy said, first of all, I think the goal would be to reduce operations at the airport. Once 2015 rolls around and we have a little more flexibility to do that. Some of that might involve the flight schools, and I think the question of how many flight schools do we need is an important one. We blocked granting, well, we recommended to the city manager, who agreed with us, and blocked issuing leases to 2 additional flight schools, because our view as a commission was we have no idea how many Santa Monica ought to have and how many, what the impact of those would be. But I do think that you know, these are things that we did also look to RAND and HRNA to help us understand better. And we too, at least I can speak for myself, chair of the commission, I was very disappointed with the studies that we got. And the RAND study should have addressed aviation practices as well as non-aviation, or only focused on the non-aviation ones. And based on the way that it was billed as the City Council was considering this contract, there was the impression that I had was that they were to look at best practices around the country and around the world with respect to both aviation and non-aviation, and we did not get that.
In terms of other solutions, Kevin, that we've discussed in our group was about the instrument of transfer and the tracts of land that it covers. I mean, the instrument of transfer does have, let's see, states that the airport, when the federal government deeded the land back to the city after World War II, it designated certain tracts in the instrument of transfer. The airport's made of 227 acres, but the tracts didn't cover all the acreage at the airport. And so we hope the city explores their options because the language in the instrument of transfer doesn't necessarily cover all the land of the airport, and a portion of that uncovered land is part of the runway. So there is a possibility you can still comply with the instrument of transfer but end up with a shorter runway, and we really hope the city explores that in depth.
Just real quickly, I wanted to mention a couple of things. As was indicated earlier, the FAA has a tremendous amount of oversight in terms of the operation of the airport. And I refer folks back to the city's webpage. The city attorney did a very good presentation on the legal constraints associated with the airport at the October 4th meeting. And it's helpful reading for everybody to really understand how much authority, broad authority, the FAA has. In terms of the studies that were done, in terms of the RAND study, it was focused on just the non-aviation uses of the airport. I think part of it was to understand that moving to the phase 2 was not to prejudice the answers in any way or direct folks into an answer, but the whole idea of phase 2 is to get input from the entire community in terms of your ideas for what the airport could be, if it's from one end of the spectrum to the other, but to have it in a broad open sense. In terms of that, rather than focusing on specific ideas, just to open to all ideas. And so once those ideas come forth, then hopefully it generates a series of themes that then can be further explored in more detail, because it will take a lot of ideas and effort, but it's also to build a record, to go back and have, as city manager has discussions with the FAA in terms of being able to say, look, this is what under council's direction, this is what the community wants to see happen at the airport. So it shows a record, it shows that the community has been behind this. It's not just one person or a group of people, but the entire community. And that's the whole idea of the phase 2 process, to open up and get that information to the entire community. They'll then be able to delve down in phase 3 and come up with a series of themes.
The Ocean Park Association asked us to have this panel tonight to get some of this information out to help people be better participants in the process. And before we wrap up, we will quickly go through again what the next steps are going to be. But this was also called to specifically address the issues that Ocean Park has with aircraft. And Mark, you just pointed out that really a lot of it is up to the FAA. They decide what goes where. Joe, you operate a flight school. I assume you're a pilot yourself. You fly. Could you help us understand, when you choose to take off, how much leeway do you have in where you go? Who tells you where to fly? How much free will do you have in where you go? And what are pilots in general being told about the fact that there's a community here underneath their flight path that feels very impacted by the aircraft?
As far as where we go, the noise abatement procedure established in the 1984 agreement is that we fly over the runway to the very end of the runway and then turn left 10 degrees towards the golf course. And then at the center of the golf course, turn right, fly the center of the golf course out to Lincoln Boulevard. And if we're making left turns, I'm doing runway 21, which is the most used runway. We make a left turn, follow Lincoln, move over by Venice and fly the downwind. If we're going to make a right turn, any right turn departure, standard procedure, without fog, without the tower telling us to turn early, we would take it all the way to the beach from the golf course heading and then turn right as we reach the beach. Things can change that, Things can change that, like if there's a jet departing behind us, the tower will ask us to turn early. head for the Santa Monica Pier now. Turn left, head for Marina Del Rey now. And we have to do what they say. And there is the option the pilot has when he takes off. If there is a wall of fog, that he's concerned. Many pilots are leaving on what's called a visual departure, VFR, not instrument, and they don't go through fog. They're supposed to stay out of it. So they'll turn early. They'll oftentimes request that prior to the departure, an early turn for cloud avoidance. In that case, they can really turn wherever they deem it safe, to turn and avoid the weather. Along the same lines of this, I would like to make a little announcement. The flight schools did get together. This was even prior to the meeting where I was at the commission meeting, and discussed, okay, how can we make it nicer? One of the things,